Thank you everyone for joining after lunch. And we may have a few more people coming in, but we'll get started. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our campus of UTS now stands. I live in Redfern, which is a site of long-term Aboriginal life and resistance. And I also acknowledge those that may be joining online from other lands. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. So today we have a great panel session. I'm going to introduce the session chair, and then I will hand over to this panel group. So Federico Marcon is the Associate Director Development at Deakin University. Prior to moving to Australia, he's worked for the European Commission, the United Nations, and many other regions. So have a look in the program if you want to see the profiles of all our wonderful speakers. Today, the topic is Innovating for Impact, a university-led partnership to promote humanitarian leadership. And just encouraging you to think about what questions you'd like to ask the panel, or what suggestions or comments you'd like to give, and we can take them throughout the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tamara, and good afternoon to you all. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of this land where we meet today. And if you don't mind me taking just 1 minute to do it slightly differently. When I was working at the UN, I did some work in Gaza, and I remember one day I was walking with a local leader, and all of a sudden this person stopped for 30 seconds, and he was standing still, and I was a bit confused, and I said, why are you doing that? And he said, well, every day I do that because I want to try to feel the connection with the land, because this is what I consider my land, but I'm not sure whether this will be my land in the future. So every day I do that, and I just try to bring my energy there to feel the connection. And then in the last 2 days, we have discussed a lot about the future of the Pacific Island. Some of the islands are under the threat of disappearing in 20, 30 years. We also follow the news, and we see a lot of people who live in a country where they've been living for 20 years. They work there, their kids study there, and all of a sudden they are taken to another country. So it really reminds me the importance of not taking for granted that where we are is where we will always be. And so this is, I'm going to just pause for 10 seconds. I've done this a few times, where you just try to feel the connection with the land and just think, this is the best way for us to show gratitude to the traditional owners of this land, because we are allowed in a way to be here and to be able to put our feet on the land. So just 10 minutes if you can just reflect on that. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for doing that. And because we are in the thank you phase, I also wanted to thank my colleagues here on stage. So Supipi Jawardena, who is the head of Scaling Impact at the Fred Hollows Foundation, Mariana McGlasson, who is the director of the Center for Humanitarian Leadership at Deakin University, and Matt Tinkler, who is the group CEO of Save the Children Australia. Particular thank you to Matt and Mariana, because they flew from Melbourne this morning to be here. Of course, they've got a very good reason to fly out of Melbourne in July and come here to Sydney. But we really appreciate you guys being here, and thank you, Supipi, for making the time. They are our panelists. There will be a lot of brain power on stage here, but I know there is also a lot of brain power in the audience. So I asked the chair permission to slightly change the format of this session. So usually this session we do questions, and of course, I prepare all my questions and my notes, so I did all my homework, but I would also prefer not to go on for 1 hour and 20 minutes and then do Q&A in the last 15 minutes. So please, if there is anything that you want to comment, that you want to ask any question, raise your hand, seek eye contact with me, and we're very happy to divert our session in what is most useful for you. So for me, I mean, this is the conference where people tear out pages from books, as we saw yesterday. If I can just kind of tear this document and don't, not go through all the questions, that's definitely the best outcome of this session, because it's also second day, afternoon, people are thinking about your flight back home or whatever. So I will try my best to make this as interesting and as interactive as ever. I start with the first question, but then I will check with you if there is any comment, any question during the session. So the first question is for all of you, and Mariana, if you can go first. So in the last few years, of course, migration, climate change, pandemics, all these new challenges have also kind of changed the way we operate in the humanitarian sector. And today we're going to talk about leadership, and we're going to talk about local leadership. So the question is how all these changes have impacted the way we conceptualize and we practice leadership. Also with a little bit of a caveat that whenever we watch television these days, the leadership style that is more evident and more prevalent these days in the most famous politicians and the most famous businessmen is the kind of leadership style that probably no one in this room likes, and this is definitely not the leadership style that we want to promote in development and humanitarian. So the question is really also how can you reconcile what the prevalent narrative these days is with what you are trying to do in your job to make sure that the right leadership is applied in the right context. Mariana, over to you. Thank you.
Test? Yes. So I'm Mariana McGlasson. As Federico mentioned, I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Leadership at Deakin University. I'll tell you a little bit about my story and why I'm passionate about local leadership, because I think in a panel like this, I hope we can bring some authenticity. It's almost in some ways a carryover from the session just before lunch in this room where I got to hear from all of you about the Women's Leadership Initiative. And so much of that resonated. So I'm a nurse practitioner by training. I worked in clinical practice in the US. About 15-ish years ago, I thought I would do a little assignment with Doctors Without Borders. It was a little bit of a white savior moment. I thought I'm going to go do this thing and it's going to be great and I'll get pats on the back and I'll feel really fulfilled. That was a long time ago. I never left the humanitarian sector because what I actually found was that coming alongside local leaders in places like Nigeria, Bougainville, and all across the Middle East, if I was coming as a learner rather than a leader or a manager coming and managing them, everything was better. I was learning, they were learning, we were working collaboratively. So when I came to Australia in 2019, 2020, took the job at Center for Humanitarian Leadership, I was at a time of personally questioning the entire humanitarian system. We were in a pandemic. We were in the second wave of the global Black Lives Matter movement, and I was dealing with a lot of my own power positionality and thinking a lot about leaders in Syria and how they were quite literally excluded from coordination meetings in 2012 because they weren't neutral. And thinking about what we could have done differently in 2012 to support Syrian leaders and their leadership journey. And so that's what we do. We support humanitarian leaders, crisis leaders, disaster responders, first responders in many, many, many different contexts. I think over 90 countries now. We've got thousands of graduates of our programs, accredited and non-accredited programs. I think you would have a hard time finding a disaster or humanitarian crisis in the world right now without a CHL graduate leading an organization, whether it's a local or an international organization. And that's something I am deeply proud of because the best part of my job is being able to hold space in rooms with leaders to give them space to reflect on leadership. And what really resonated from this session before lunch about leadership is this idea, and this is now answering your question. We have these sort of leadership characters all around the world. It's white, Western, Northern. It's dominant. It's male. It's masculine. And that's the leadership that people think of when they think of leadership. And that's the leadership that is often at the heart of most leadership programs. What I think the world needs in a polycrisis, so all of those different crises you mentioned, migration, climate, conflict, political, geopolitical, and as our world changes, and you can hear my accent, I'm American. I'm now a dual citizen, so I can happily say I have a second passport at a time when my country is stepping back from the leadership role it's held for the last 70 to 80 years. And what does that mean in a multipolar world? So we are living in the polycrisis, and there is probably more to come. We need leadership that is heterogeneous. Leadership in the Pacific is not the same as leadership in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Middle East. And all of them are valid, and all of them have a richness and a flexibility and a cultural appropriateness. The concepts of feminist leadership and how those are applied, and I would say far superior to the leadership that has clearly not served us well in the past from political leaders. So yeah, that would be my sort of long answer. And you can probably already hear I'm very passionate about how we can support leadership in different ways all over the world.
Thanks, Marianne. Matt, do you want to go next? The mic, please. Yeah.
Well, it was a great start, Marianne. What's interesting, I think, for an organization like Save the Children, which is a very traditional actor in development and humanitarianism, is what role do we play in this moment, and particularly dealing with the fallout from the US funding withdrawal. The sort of posture we've adopted is one that says we want to be locally led and globally connected. And I think the way I see our role is a sort of ethical intermediary as much as possible, that in aid and development, there is always going to be a role for organizations that are accredited to major donors like a DFAT or a Green Climate Fund or a World Bank. And they have to be a conduit, an ethical conduit of that funding to local leadership as close to the ground as possible. So it's interesting watching Save the Children as a very old, 105 years old, very established, very powerful actor in that context, think about what's the way that we can simultaneously leverage more resources in a resource-constrained environment, but transfer authority and power and support to the places where it's needed most. And the thing that resonates, I think, for us at the moment is this notion of an ethical intermediary, that sometimes we will still be implementing programs in a really fragile context, but more often than not, we will be standing behind local governments, local leaders, civil society, and giving them the resources and support they need to create impact with all of the cultural knowledge and wisdom that they hold. And we know the outcomes for children in our case will be much better for that local leadership, that local knowledge. But it's interesting because a lot of our staff wrestle with this. They think, shouldn't we be shrinking? Shouldn't we be getting out of the way? And shouldn't we cease to exist? And I really challenge that and say, I don't think so. Like, I don't think, we just signed a $50 million partnership with the Green Climate Fund in PNG last week for a 3-country program to build resilience in schools to the impacts of climate change in Tonga, Cambodia, and South Sudan. Now, none of those governments are accredited to the Green Climate Fund. None of them would get that money, but for us saying we want to build a program and support your ambition to improve school resilience and infrastructure. So I think there is a role for us there, but we've got to do it on the right terms in the way that empowers local leadership, lead from behind in this case, and empower others to do what they can do best.
Thank you. And I see we have here in the audience, I was coming to you, Damex, because this morning you were saying that sometimes the development sector with all these contracts going to managing contractors was a little bit of a concern for you. So I was kind of thinking maybe you might be happy to see that the Green Climate Fund has actually decided to partner with Save the Children, not only in PNG, but in a lot of other countries in the Pacific. Please feel free to jump in if you have any comment.
Yeah, and so the reason we are the intermediary is because the country doesn't have any direct access to the Green Climate Fund. So it's
Fund has made it very difficult for Pacific countries to have membership. It's not just Papua New Guinea.
Yep.
So the criteria that's set. So what are the donors expecting? And yes, I know there is corruption in Papua New Guinea, and that the climate officers had a lot of questions, but it's about putting that right. Yep. Not having more money being spent on behalf of the climate office. I mean, but the government of Papua New Guinea probably agreed to all this. I just think it's bizarre.
So when I was in PNG last week and talking to the Climate Change Authority, we were talking about the plans to generate funding to improve school resilience to the impacts of climate change. And the main question they had for me in the conversation was, who's going to wear all of the time and bureaucracy of dealing with the Green Climate Fund? Because it's very difficult to deal with, very hard to access, very hard to get money from. And we said, we will deal with that, and we will empower you to deliver the programs on behalf of your people. So that's the way we see our role, is leveraging the money, passing it through government in order to create the impact for children.
What's the mandate of Save the Children?
Children.
The issues in Papua New Guinea around children is serious. Many of us know the history of Save the Children in Papua New Guinea, the office. So I'm just surprised that you're branching into another area. And, you know, I don't want to get into a one-on-one here. Just think it's just...
And happy to have a chat after if you like, yeah.
No, but I think this is, you know, we've been talking for 2 days about reinventing the sector and try to do things differently. So I actually welcome this conversation. I think it's more interesting than, you know, my pre-prepared set of questions, definitely. So thank you for contributing. I think we are all very happy to be challenged, like whatever we say. Like, I know my 3 colleagues pretty well, and, you know, they're very honest, and, you know, they will be happy to engage in this type of conversation during the session. I'm pretty sure about that. So Pippi, over to you.
Thank you. Probably I come with a little bit of a different background to the 3 I'm sitting with. So I was born to one of the world's largest conflicts in the world in Sri Lanka in 1983. So probably in that context, still one could argue I was one of the privileged. So when you look at context and how it evolves, also there's a world view from looking from top down as well as looking from bottom up, I want to say. And leadership in my view is framed from more or less looking from my foundations. More than half of my life. So I've seen the bombs, I've seen the discriminations, and I've worked in similar contexts. So for me, the most important part of leadership is dialogue. Because if the dialogue is broken, I don't think there is any leadership whatsoever. And at the moment in the world, what we probably see at the top end, at the bottom end, is some of those broken dialogues. So, and when I say a dialogue, and then it comes the basic ABCs of any dialogue, which is the context, the actors, the attitudes we bring into that dialogue. So all those things come together from the leadership that I would aspire to see in this sector. And today I work for Fred Hollows Foundation, purely because I'm intentional in where I work, purely because of where I have come from. So when I moved to Australia, I decided not to work in programs. I went to a couple of interviews, spoke to people, because an interview is about me choosing the organization as much as the organization selecting me. Unfortunately, it didn't satisfy my liking to be in a programming role from the other side of the table. And I was questioning, is that an opportunity for us to rebuild the table? Because that's what we did as peace negotiators sometime back in early 2000s as part of Sri Lankan conflict. Because a table is about balanced power. If you look at this table, it doesn't have balance of power. So we designed a diamond table to give balance and equality of power. So for me, leadership is all these questions coming in and our ability to bring that lived experience to the center. And in today's world, leadership for me is also about who more than the what and the how. So the constant change you see in those famous figures of the sectors in the development discourse against the leaders who actually need to bring the voice, the people who need to lead self from the global south and bring that voice to the table. So all that combination comprise what leadership means for me in this current context.
Thank you, Supriti. Thank you. Any comment, any question? Right, so I'll move to the next one, which is actually a follow-up, and this is for Matt and Mariana on the Center for Humanitarian Leadership, which is a joint venture between Deakin University and Save the Children. So when I moved to Australia, I worked for a few NGOs, and so for me, a university was the place where you would look for partnership if you needed some technical assistance, monitoring and evaluation, baseline survey, all this kind of stuff. Like it was a client-provider relationship. And then I moved to work for a university. And then in a university, you think, oh, we might need an NGO because we got this amazing program, amazing academics and researchers. We need to implement this program in a country. We don't have local partnership. Let's see if any NGO can help us deliver the program. So it seems to me that it's always been pretty tactical and not really strategic. So when I moved to Deakin and I met Mariana and I learned more about the Center for Humanitarian Leadership, I said, okay, this is actually a strategic partnership. It's not a transactional one. It is a real joint value proposition. So I think it's such a good practice. And maybe starting with Matt and then Mariana, if you can maybe tell us a little bit more about that and how do you think this is different from the traditional academia NGO relationship that we see in many other instances?
Yeah, so the original idea was, it's again about partnership, right? So we are experts in child rights globally, and we are good at development and humanitarian work around child rights issues, but we're not experts in leadership. And we saw an opportunity about a decade ago, really, where some of the people most in need of leadership capability training and support, humanitarian actors dealing with crises in countries around the world, didn't have access to quality leadership training and support. So, and that's a problem for Save the Children and our workforce and our partners as well. But it's so in terms of building professional development and capability in our staff, the idea was, why don't we leverage the best leadership and capability training, and why don't we do that in partnership with an academic institution? And the partnership with Deakin University was born that way, initially as a leadership program for humanitarians run by the university, but informed by the field knowledge and expertise of a development actor like Save the Children, and leveraging our networks and peers as well to generate students in the course. So what I've really enjoyed about the partnership is, I think Deakin, better than most universities in my experience, value genuine industry partnership. A lot of their best research and products are done in collaboration with industry partners, be that a highly technical engineering or humanitarian leadership. And we just are the industry partner in this particular project. And over the years, it's evolved to be not just about Save the Children, but also bringing in other peer organisations from around the world into the management structure and leadership team supporting the program. And the centre itself, I think, has evolved a lot more beyond that initial idea towards something more about system reform and system change. But perhaps I'll leave Mariana to talk a bit more about that.
I think what Matt described about the beginning, what's interesting about this partnership is that it quite literally was the back of a napkin. It was actually a Save the Children staff who said, sort of early, like 2011, 2012, off the back of many large-scale humanitarian disasters. The learning, and I'll put this in air quotes, coming out of that all had a theme. It was this whole, under the guise of professionalization of the sector. This will come full circle. Within that concept of professionalization was we need better leadership because better leadership will result, in theory, in better humanitarian responses, more efficient use, easier, better scale up. That concept of professionalization, I believe, got a little bit twisted and corrupted over the years and actually was used to exclude and put local partners on this never-ending hamster wheel of capacity development. So there's a little bit of tension in that. But that was, CHL was born to meet the need of the leadership gap in the formal UN-led and INGO-led humanitarian system. Now, what Matt's referring to about our evolution, when I came in 2020, I told you before that I was wrestling with all of the power dynamics and my role in those power dynamics. And why did I get a seat at some tables when the information that informed my opinion at that seat was through dialogue and conversations with my Syrian or my Yemeni or other colleagues? It just felt very wrong that I was given this magic wand to be at tables and making decisions and be pulled back to DC to talk to senators, but really it was my Syrian colleagues or other colleagues that were informing that. So I was really wrestling with this. And what I think is beautiful about this partnership, and Matt will remember this well, I came on board and said, hey, let's change the strategy and let's focus on systems change. Well, that's could have been a partnership ender because, as Matt has referenced, Save the Children is, one of these traditional actors in that system we were saying needed to change. But instead of that ending the partnership, it deepened the partnership. And we had a mutually challenging conversation, I think, where that us changing our strategy created reflection in Matt's team about their Pacific strategy and their relationship with Pacific partners and how that capacity building, so I hate the term capacity building, how leadership development targeted for local leaders, local is also a complicated term, it became a mutually reinforcing ambition, and we had some respectful but challenging conversations about what that meant. When I came with a strategy to a board that consisted at that time mostly of people working at INGOs, you can imagine there was a little bit of discomfort, like, oh, this is a little bit radical. I'm sitting on this board. How's that going to affect my, my public image? Can we buy into this? But over time, we evolved together. And even in the last year, we as CHL have dialed that up more. We are less and less focusing our attention and energy on systems change. And we're moving, I would say, further into the space of supporting hyper-local leadership, very small CSO leaders, mutual aid movements, because actually this whole conversation about the humanitarian reset, I have one criteria of whether or not that's successful. In 5 years, are there less people in need or more people receiving the need, having their needs met? I think the humanitarian reset will play itself out and the system itself will remain largely as is, slightly more financially efficient and mostly the same people holding power. So we are going to be putting our energy into creating new systems and new opportunities and new leadership movements around the world. And contrary to what might be the perception of Save the Children has actually been a resource, a challenge, place for us to reflect and refine and think. And that, I think, is good partnership. As you said, it's dialogue. It's sticking together through the various changes, somewhat like a marriage. Two people don't get married at age 20 and they're still the same people at age 70. You have different people you're basically married to during that time as you evolve, hopefully. So I think that's, for me, why this partnership is very different. We are, Deakin has a lot of industry partnerships, but even within Deakin, this one is a little bit out of the box because Save the Children has a seat at the table of the governance, the decision-making over financial matters to some degree. And we ride with it through all the various phases. And I think that makes it a good partnership.
Thank you. Thanks to you both. Again, any comment, any question? I would be surprised if
There is one in the chat box.
there is one in the chat box, please.
Yeah. So it is humanitarian crises are mostly outside our region, i.e. Middle East and Africa. In what ways is Australia placed well in responding and leading in the humanitarian space? Now, I wouldn't really agree with the statement. So maybe responding, how do you choose about where you work in terms of humanitarian effort? Why maybe in other regions or, yeah.
So, Pippi, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so probably the way we define what is a humanitarian crisis needs to be first thought through. In Australia, in one way, I would say, as somebody who worked very closely with Save the Children on constantly responding to disasters as part of Australian Red Cross, I would define that, redefine that there is humanitarian crisis from in home as well as in the rest of the world. The question specifically on a more broadly, the role of Australia, if the question particularly focuses about that big picture, the bigger conflict, humanitarian conflict, like the one in the Middle East. If you look at, I mean, this is a great one. I'm in the middle of writing something on this particular topic, so I can go to town with it if you want, but I won't. It's purely because if you look at the negotiations or the dialogue, which I call is a key component of the leadership, who facilitated the dialogue between the two powerful actors that de-escalated the biggest humanitarian conflict? It's not any of the known Western states. Australia increasingly have a significant role to play in this context because you saw the countries like Qatar, Cyprus, Bahrain taking the world stage, negotiating the dialogue, creating the discourse, dialogue between the powerful actors. And Australia may sit with that alliance, but we are always seen as the get things done southern actor. We are always seen in the global humanitarian development discourse as that sideline southern actor from a global point of view, right? When you look at it from a New York, Geneva, London point of view to this side. So for me, to maintain peace in this particular region, if you're looking humanitarian crisis only in that region, there is a significant role Australia can play. But when it comes to Pacific, Australia carries a significant baggage. So in my personal opinion, like Australia can play in the broader discourse. Now, again, highlighting personal opinion, New Zealand has a significant role to play with countries like Singapore and even like small states like Sri Lanka, because they're neutral, bipartisan, and they have the ability to bring the so-called larger leaders to the dialogue and to the discourse. So we need to look at the world order from a humanitarian and a development point of view in a different way is what I'm trying to challenge all of us collectively.
I might jump in on that. I would agree with this completely. I think we have been trying to reclaim the word humanitarian and broaden it. The UN-led system has sort of owned that word, and it's actually become an exclusionary term. We don't call our programs anymore humanitarian leadership programs. We call them crisis leadership programs. Because if a war breaks out in your country or a cyclone comes to your country, whatever sector you're working in, it's all hands on deck. Communities come together to support communities in the traditional ways they always have. The vast majority of the resources and the ways that communities survive have nothing to do with Geneva or New York. But that's what gets all the attention. And they took this word humanitarian and it became a sector. And we tried to professionalize it. And if you weren't professionalized, you didn't get a seat at the table. So we've been trying to flip that narrative upside down, and we changed it to crisis leadership. And when we say humanitarian or crisis, we mean disasters, climate in Australia, outside of Australia. We do run some leadership programs here in Australia exactly for this reason. Because if you talk to communities in Australia that are affected by floods, they have almost the same complaints that other people in other countries have about the UN system. They made decisions in Canberra and they sent resources for the wrong program, and no one talked to us and there was no dialogue, and we were eventually left on our own to kind of sort it out. That same narrative plays around the world. So again, how do we empower frontline responders in a world where we are looking down the barrel of climate crisis in multiple regions all at the same time and build heterogeneous forms of leadership. I love the example of Qatar. I also have been just spending a lot of time in the Middle East and marveling at these different forms of leadership that are popping up and saying, you know what, U.S. leadership, not working out for us. So we're going to have a seat. We're going to, create a new table. And I think we need more of that all over the world.
Thanks, Mariana. Matt, I know you probably have to say something, but do you mind if I ask you a little bit of a follow-up question, and then you can, because we had this conversation over lunch about how Save the Children is responding to this changing world. So this morning I was reading a report from a think tank in Geneva called Geneva Solution, and they were basically going through all the cuts that UN agencies are doing because of the US funding cuts. So you got organizations like UNAIDS, they're cutting 54% of their staff, the International Organization for Migration, 20%, WHO between 15 and 20%. And so we are all panicking for that. And then there was a comment done by someone saying, well, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, he got rid of, I can't remember, 50, 60% of the total workforce. And so we were saying, Twitter will disappear, and they're still there. So I really ask you to put, the toughest self-criticism hat here. And I know everybody's saying, maybe there is an opportunity here. There is an opportunity to rethink our business. I'm not a big fan of, kind of reset, go back to the starting line. We need to dismantle everything. Everything is not working. I'm not a big fan of this idea. I think, we should be working on incremental progresses and improvement, but this is my personal opinion. But if we can be very honest here, and starting with you, Matt, and what Save the Children is doing, do you think there is really an opportunity there? And of course, you manage the office in Australia. How heavily has Save the Children Australia been impacted by that? And what are the remedial actions you will put in place?
So for us, there's two stories. One is the global story and one's the local story. The global story is very difficult. So Save the Children had about 350, 400 million US funding per year from USAID. So we have lost about 3,500 staff. We've closed multiple country offices. We have ended life-saving programs. We have seen people die who would have survived, but for the USAID cuts, no question, it's been catastrophic for the global organization in many respects. That said, the organization has responded quickly and appropriately, perhaps somewhat harshly in the view of some, to make very hard decisions very fast to quarterize the impact and allow us to survive and continue to do life-saving work. And that's required a whole of world full court press from leadership, including from here. The local story is very different. So my own organization that I look after in Australia and the Pacific has not really been impacted at all. If anything, actually, we have seen a slight improvement in our position in response to the US funding withdrawal, because we've gone hard to donors, partners, supporters, and said, help us save lives at this moment in time. But I think the reason we have been resilient here is we saw a version of this a decade ago in Australia. So back in 2014, the Abbott government folded AusAid into DFAT. They cut the Australian aid program. They pulled out of Africa and the Middle East. They aligned Australia's aid program with what was perceived to be Australia's national interest. Now that sounds familiar. It sounds exactly what Trump's done. He's just done it in a much more chaotic and cruel kind of way with US aid. But our strategy organisationally was to diversify in response. We were the largest NGO funded by DFAT, and we said, therefore, we've got the most at risk. If we don't diversify, we will wither and we won't have scale. We won't succeed in our mission. So we did that by diversifying our institutional donor base. So we became accredited to the Green Climate Fund, the Global Partnership for Education, Education Cannot Wait, and those funds are all quite resilient at this moment. We grew our domestic footprint in service delivery for children in Australia, which is about a $60 million portfolio through mergers and acquisitions. We created a suite of social ventures, a book publishing company called Library for All, an impact investment fund, and an evidence intermediary called the Centre for Evidence and Implementation. So what I saw over that time is diversification creates complexity, and we have to manage through that, but creates resilience. We're not relying on any one donor or any one operating model to create impact. And at a time of global shock, therefore, we are weathering the storm quite well in this region, which allows me to support my global colleagues and offer a pathway for the future for them, but also continue to support children's needs here and in the region, which is what we're here for.
Thank you. So, Pivi, I might come to you because you work for an Australian NGO that has become a global NGO, and maybe I partially disagree with you about the power of influence of Australia. I feel that our power is actually declining very rapidly because of a few other actors emerging. But again, this is for a conversation over a coffee. I'm kind of wondering whether to be able to become and to continue to be a global organization and promote some of the values that are embedded in your organization at a global scale, what is the challenge now compared to maybe what the foundation was doing 5 or 10 years ago, where the war was probably more Western focus, if I can call it. So does it require a lot of adaptation for you guys? Because you're still here, the headquarters is in Australia. So of course, as much as you want to try to be global, but there's still this baggage that you carry from, being a Western NGO, if I call it like that.
Yeah, in Australian sense, it is a Western NGO, but if you go and ask New York and Geneva, they're like, who? Like, nobody knows. But I think the beauty of the Fred Hollows Foundation, I mean, Fred was this disruptor, as I call him, who spoke about grand bargain principles that we are talking since 2016. Now we have 2.3, 3.0 as well. Those principles he spoke in the 1980s. So at the time he first went to Vietnam, he said, you're not going to send Australian doctors and Australian people to Vietnam and start offices there. So number one philosophy for the foundation is you teach to fish, you never fish for them. So you will not see Fred Hollows Foundation sending delegates to internationally to any of the 25 countries they have a presence in. The funding architecture as a result, those who remember Fred on TV will remember, it's completely built on the mums and dads of Australia. So when we had the 30th year anniversary few years ago, 2 years ago, in Sydney Town Hall, it was full. And I know the struggle of filling that big hall in Sydney Town Hall, because Australian Red Cross is to try to get all these events and other NGOs that I've worked with or institutions. It's a struggle, but there was no struggle for us. There were people standing all the way until out because we think we have led by the example. The HQ is owned by the people of this country. It's a household brand. And 130 million budget today, still a majority comes from Australia. Because of taking the brand global point of view, I mean, I think that it's an example for any Australian university or others who would like to go globally as well. If you look at it, what we have done is a hub model. So we have a hub in Asia, we have a hub in UK, a hub in US. It's a shared power hub. I mean, there are a lot of learnings and things for us to improve as an organization because we claim ourselves to be a learning organization. And in that, we will make sure that our roles and responsibilities are very clear. There will be technical people available when the countries need to take their support. But what we are trying to do in a resource-constrained world is, okay, there's some small impact of the USAID government funding, but we actually to look at the systems point of view, the system we are working in has significant impacts. So let's take Ethiopia, Kenya, they're significantly impacted. So then how do you prioritize? So in our case, we have prioritized with the government and the other sector partners, because the health system is hugely disrupted. let's prioritize the most infectious diseases, because if we stop that, it's going to take us back decades. And so life-saving, essentially in an indirect way, has come to the forefront. But the other thing we tend to do is to go back to the drawing board. This is where I always think strategy no longer is a nice piece of paper that can sit on the table for 5 years. It's about rewriting the formula. Can we find the right formula that 1 + 1 is no longer 2, but it's 3? And in that, I mean, I do tend to believe that system is probably broken. It's not only because of USAID funding. Like if you look at PNG, if you look at Sri Lanka, can I say the system is working? I mean, hand on heart, as a Sri Lankan, can't say the system is working. So we need to recognize the system is broken and be innovative in terms of looking at the solutions. And this is also why I went back to that leadership question of who leads. Because if I am not in the system, as somebody who have the hands-on experience, I wouldn't know that the system is broken. We will be putting money after money to that broken systems. I call.
Mariana, can I ask a question? Just while you were listening to Matt and Supipi, so talking about resource constraint, talking about Save the Children having, unfortunately, to lay off people. Supipi was actually talking about now we need to work on the most important emergencies in a way and save lives. Does it mean that we need to change the way we teach crisis leadership? Does it mean that part of the curriculum needs to be how you can be a leader with less people in your team, or how can you be a leader just focusing on what is incredibly urgent versus what would be more long-term, strategic or sustainable? Do you think there will be an impact on the way the center will position the leadership program in the future? Is the paradigm changing, and so we need to also adapt the way we teach leadership?
Very interesting question. I think we were already looking at the system as broken for the last 5 years. And our view of that and how strong we feel about that has only gotten stronger and deeper, and I would argue potentially a little bit more radical. You're correct. This current crisis was made much more nasty by the way it was done by USAID. It didn't have to be so cruel. It didn't have to be so sudden. But the system has not been working for end users, if we want to use that terminology, for a long time. Therefore, our leadership model, as we increasingly, so in 2020, probably 80% of the people who came to the CHL, that program was a 10-month fully accredited graduate certificate. But probably 80% of people who attended that program in the preceding decade were staff of INGOs. Probably not as diverse as you would hope. A lot of people like me, a lot of people like you, who didn't frankly need another graduate certificate. But yeah, their leadership improved. They describe it as the most transformative thing they've ever done. But I looked at that and I thought, no, I don't need another free graduate certificate. I know a lot of people who do need that, though. So we just did a pivot. And our most recent estimates are that probably 95% of people who come through our leadership programs would self-identify as Global South or working for a local organization. So we've just completely shifted the resourcing, and we've shifted the heart of the curriculum. People do need to understand the international humanitarian system. They need to understand coordination. They need to understand the lingo and the acronyms, so when they sit at those tables, they have the confidence they need, because that's a very intimidating thing. But as we teach them about humanitarian leadership and humanitarian principles and where they came from and coordination and how it was articulated, we say to Ukrainians, for example, you just heard that, we've been talking about humanitarian principles. We'd like a guest speaker now to come from a besieged hospital in Syria to talk to you about what neutrality looks like when your own government is dropping bombs on you. Let's talk about that. Let's not talk about the Swiss values in the black and white pure way that it's normally taught. But let's talk about the real conversation. Okay, you just heard $20 million or $20 billion or whatever the figure is this week has been granted in the international space for Sudan. Yet all of you are working as volunteers. Where is that money, and why are you all working as volunteers, and who's making those decisions? So we're trying to create a little bit of radicalism so that people don't become humanitarian professionals and just accept that that status quo is normal. Just to turn your question around a little bit, I believe in my conversations with local leaders, if I ask them, so I'll give another example from Ukraine. A guy started an NGO to provide chemotherapy drugs in besieged areas or behind sort of front lines during the war in Ukraine. People with cancer normally get completely left behind in a humanitarian context because that's not life-saving, which is weird, but you won't find chemotherapy drugs in the WHO standard medication list. He said, I don't care, I'm going to find a way to do it. He created an NGO. They began smuggling chemotherapy drugs and setting up clinics in besieged areas, and it's an amazing story. So just for curiosity, I called him and I said, if I could find funding, you're a graduate of our leadership programs, I know your capacity. If I could find 10 Ukrainian NGOs, this was a conversation you and I had. So I talked to all of these different NGOs in Ukraine, and I said, if money wasn't an issue, and if no one from outside Ukraine was telling you what program you had to run, oh, it has to be health, oh, it has to be a food program, oh, it has to be whatever, shelter. How much money do you need, and what would you do with that? Every single one of those local leaders already knows how to work with not enough resources. They know how to scale up with the next dollar they get. They know what staff member they're missing and what other 3 they need to hire. And I actually think if we just change the conversation and listen to them more, they already have, in most contexts, they have 90% of the answer they need, and with just a little bit of dialogue. And I think that's sort of when we're talking about the role of international organizations, facilitating those conversations, bringing together the funding from different places. I think those leaders already, they already have a lot of what they need. We talked about, I was listening to the Women's Leadership Initiative, the chat before this one, and listening to what they found to be the most valuable components. And someone said that building the confidence that they are already a leader, and there's not some professionalization process leaders need to go through before they are, oh, okay, now you're a leader. There's something really powerful about just changing the starting point of the conversation, I think. So long answer, but yes, we adapt our leadership framework regularly because the world is changing regularly.
Thank you, thank you. So we got a question from Kate. Kate, just wait for the mic, please. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to understand this partnership a bit better. So I guess question for Mariana. I have 2 questions. So are you training the trainers, or are you actually, as Deakin University in partnership with Save the Children, delivering all these programs of? And the other question is it just about delivering these humanitarian leadership programs, or as a kind of like an NGO university partnership, are you actually trying to do any research around this? And if so, what role does Save the Children play, and how do you maintain this ongoing commitment from an NGO? I guess because I think it's always difficult, between academics and and partner organizations to maintain that kind of.
Sounds like you've worked in a similar environment. So the culture of how a university works and the culture of how an INGO works are very different. So my job as the executive director is a lot of negotiating those two it's just polar opposites. So we spend a lot of time negotiating that. The governance of the center is really interesting. So Save the Children doesn't fund Center for Humanitarian Leadership. Matt's the chair of the board, and another senior member of his team sit on the board, and jointly together with 2 members of Deakin and 6 to 8 members from other organizations all over the world, it's an advisory board and a governance board. So I sort of report to the executive dean and also to the board. And there's a navigation of those because sometimes Deakin forgets that we have a board we report to. And part of my job is to pull that card. My job is to support humanitarian leaders around the world. So I spend a lot of time negotiating these various spaces. And the partnership with Save the Children actually helps us stay stable and providing some of that information. Originally, the partnership, as Matt described, was kind of a win-win. They had a leadership idea, but they wanted it to be more serious and delivered by a university, and they had staff that needed to go through a better leadership program. So there was kind of a shared value, maybe a motivation, but since then, I'll let Matt speak for himself about why SAVE continues this partnership and why Matt, as the group CEO, gives me a lot of his time and support. In terms of the research, we get funding. So we're entirely project funded. By the way, also Deakin University doesn't. We have to cover all of our own costs. So don't even get me started about that. It's a lot of proposal writing and a lot of late nights and early mornings. We secure funding. By the way, we also had USAID funding a French language graduate certificate for West and Central African leaders that was so dear to my heart. We had 70 students from West and Central Africa in their last week of a 1-year-long program when the funding was pooled. And I'm very proud to say that we used our own core funds, which are very small, to make sure those people could graduate, stop work order or not. Those people had a right to finish their studies. I don't know, I might regret that later, but I think they had a right to, we as a center have no right to exist if when something like that happens, we don't make sure those students finish. But when I get a grant, let's just use round numbers. If I get $1 million grant to deliver a leadership program, I build within that research. So it's a program we are delivering. We go through ethics, we do the whole thing, university approach, and we build a research component in the back end of that program. The donor doesn't care. We call it monitoring and evaluation and research. So the donor is happy because it's monitoring and evaluation. And we all know in the humanitarian sector, it's a pretty low bar of what's required for that. But we build a research component looking at what is humanitarian leadership? What does it enable? What enables humanitarian leadership? What are the power dynamics between the international system and the local? And now we've collected enough data over, I don't know, dozens of cohorts, maybe hundreds of cohorts at this point. We're now able to start looking at the different social network power dynamics and networks in places like a comparison between Sudan and Syria and Myanmar and Ukraine. So we're building that body of research. Watch this space. There should be some good publications coming out in the next year. But yeah, we always want to do more of that.
Maybe Matt, do you want to add anything?
Mariana covered it really well. I think for us, it's we cover our costs essentially. We contribute funding, grant-based funding that we can generate from different opportunities to the centre. But I'm pretty ruthless in covering our costs. I need to be as a CEO of a charity. But it allows us to have an accredited university partner to offer a scaled leadership training capability to our staff and partners. It allows us to have a university-led research program challenging our own understanding of our role in the humanitarian sector. And at times it also gives us a safe alternate voice on issues that are tricky for us to comment on. So sometimes we'll talk about SAVE's operational in Myanmar or Yemen or Gaza, and there's often very operational sensitive issues that allow us or restrict us from saying certain things. And sometimes we can have that conversation through the CHL as well.
Thank you. Kate, I think you had a question, right?
It's not fully formulated in my head, so apologies if so you mentioned earlier the importance of dialogue. And I'm doing my PhD at the moment looking at this sort of why aren't funds reaching where they're most needed for development. And in doing that, there is this growing divide between development practice and development finance. And it's just getting worse. And you talked earlier to the point about, well, if you didn't have a funder saying this needs to go to climate, this needs to go to this needs to go to this, what would you do? And that question, I mean, first of all, where do we create the spaces for this dialogue between development practice and finance to happen so that that feedback can be given? And to what extent, and I really don't mean this in a bad way for Save the Children, but I'm wondering to what extent when you're caught in the middle, which you guys in a sense are, you end up fueling the system because you're diversifying to be able to tap into all of these different sources of money to be able to continue to fulfill your role. But that just means then at a local level, which may explain this earlier, it's actually disempowering the groups that are on the ground that could tap into those funds if the finance system was different. So we talk about a broken system, and yet within that system, we are simultaneously fighting it and fueling it. And my question is, at what point does the dialogue happen to start to really bring those two teams into alignment so we're all pulling in the same direction?
Maybe I can just offer a brief reflection, and an example is good here. So Save Children's accredited to the Green Climate Fund. Our first project to be funded was in Vanuatu, and it's and Dame Meg, maybe to touch on your question before earlier, why are we doing this? Because climate change is an existential threat to child rights. It's impacting on child's right to health, to learning, to safety, to livelihoods every day. And the government of Vanuatu is not an entity that is accredited to the Green Climate Fund. Therefore, it can't access the finance without an intermediary. Before Save the Children was accredited, the intermediaries were all investment banks and engineering companies. So we were the first development NGO in the world to be accredited. And our view was, if we don't do it, if we don't put a child rights lens on climate finance, who will? So the first project in Vanuatu was an effort in saying to every community in Vanuatu, how is climate change impacting on your life? And how do you need support to adapt? Not to mitigate climate change, the GCF funds mitigation activities as well, but accepting that climate change is having an impact. How do we help you adapt? And we went to every province in Vanuatu, and we then raised about 50 million US from the Green Climate Fund, and we programmed entirely through the government of Vanuatu. So Save the Children is leveraging the money, helping design the program, putting the risk and assurance safeguards around that satisfy the donor. And then we are programming the money entirely through the government of Vanuatu. And that program is designed to meet the community needs, adaptation needs of the families and children in Vanuatu. So that's our attempt, pragmatically accepting the world as it is from a donor perspective, to try and address some of the challenges that you're raising, I guess. It's both. So the community's needs have defined the program design, and then the government, through its various departments, is responsible for implementing the program and trying to meet the community needs with our support if necessary, but as little as possible, as much as necessary. I know we don't have 3-year funding for Papua New Guinea. What I was touching on earlier, we had a board meeting the GCF had a board meeting in PNG. It approved a program that wasn't for PNG. What we are working on for PNG is more like a 7-year program to build climate resilience in schools. So I went to a school in East New Britain. I heard from the teachers and students, is climate change impacting on your school life? And they said, well, the river's flooding more frequently. We can't get to school. We get sent home early when it rains too much. The water tank runs dry in the summer and we don't do sport. The classrooms get too hot and therefore we don't learn. So the project we are working on for PNG is an education resilience program for PNG. It would be a 7-year program. We'd hope to be much more than 50 million US, and it would be led by the Department of Education and the Climate Change and Development Department. Again, we would be playing a role at leveraging the funding and supporting the design and meeting the compliance requirements of the GCF, because PNG is not a direct access entity. So the money doesn't flow without us. And we then put the money in the hands of the government departments and support them on delivery to the schools. That's the idea.
So Pippin?
I probably can look at it, the role of our NGOs, which essentially the great example you gave, but I think dialogue happens it's not one place. So in the transformation, I believe there are 3 dialogues, which INGOs actually bridge. That's where their biggest facilitation role happens. So there's let's call it 3 places where it happens. So you have then external stakeholders, your donors, your partners, the dialogue for transformation and change. Within the organization, I'm sure Matt leads that dialogue. How do we change the table internally? Because that's the leadership we need. How do we give that ownership, the voice, as much as possible to the people who is going through the problem rather than us deciding that? And then the INGOs also lead up to a certain degree the dialogue in that community with the people, etc. It's more than leading. It's all in all three areas. It's facilitation. And in that, you'll at times take a front seat in resource mobilization, let's call it, to bridge the financial gap. At times you take a back seat. So with a Green Climate Fund, in reality, no local organization, unfortunately, will get the money through that complexity. Unfortunate reality, right? It's brutal, but that's the unfortunate reality. But there is a dialogue which Matt and the team, I'm sure, continues to influence that process with Green Climate Fund. And I know it happens with a lot of other agencies as well. But at the same time, how do you give them the leadership and you be a partner to enable and strengthen that when it comes to other opportunities? So that's where that whole notion of leading from the front and the back keep shifting as an INGO based on the context in the 3 areas or bases of it, you can call it, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a necessary role to play behind that central role because it's structured this way. Is there a conversation to be had around should finance be structured differently given what development is? Is that fair to that?
Just hold on a moment. I'll give you the mic.
What happened in the Pacific was that the forum leaders decided that they would create the Pacific Resilience Facility. The aim was that this would be a $1 billion fund managed by the countries, and the funds to be used particularly for relocation of communities that were impacted by climate. To date, what's happened is the domicile of that fund now is in Tonga, the Kingdom of Tonga. There's about 365 million, $60 million that has been raised. I understand that there's more discussions going on in Canberra, etc. I don't know all the current legal issues that they're talking about, but a board will have to be set up, and then it'll be under the auspices of the countries themselves. And that was a reaction to the Green Climate Fund when I was Secretary General not allowing some of our countries to have membership for all sorts of reasons that they found. And at that time, when Australia played a very pivotal role in the Green Climate Fund, they were much more generous about where funding should go in the Pacific. But when I hear that international NGOs can have access and our countries can't, is this going to be the pattern that's going to continue? You know, and if that's going to be the case, then we'll see what happens with the Department of Education. We'll see what happens in East New Britain.
I might just say on that, I would very much hope and like to see Pacific Island governments having direct access. And I would like to hope in Vanuatu, after we've delivered that large project, then the government of Vanuatu would be in a position to be the next direct access entity. So I guess my view is we want money to flow to the Pacific for children. And if those governments can't access the $10 billion Green Climate Fund and we can, then we see a duty of us to access that money and transfer that wealth and power to the Pacific. And we should do it in a way that's led by community and implemented by government and put them in the driver's seat next time around. And that's the journey we are trying to be on.
Want to make a comment? And just letting you know, we've got 15 minutes left.
And they, sorry, similarly filled that because I think in terms of the UN structure that was funding malaria, tuberculosis, the government couldn't access that directly. Oil Search did. And then what happens when that organization, in a sense, changes slightly? Or so, I think it props up the system without questioning the system. That's and I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's necessary because of the system. My question is, at what point do we acknowledge that it's propping? And I don't know if that conversation is being had. It's a necessary role you fill given what it is, and it's critical. That said, should it be that way? And if we're not ever questioning that and we've got lots of props, do we ever fully acknowledge that it's not working? If we can't hear when the frustration is so evident that they're trying to create their own facilities to work around it.
DFAT funding is always just completely tied up with the people that they know. There is capacity in the region, across the Pacific. If it doesn't function the way Australia wants it to function, then there's always a reason why you can't access funds. So those conversations do need to be had, but it's extraordinary that we're having this conversation here when nobody that I know of in the development sphere in Papua New Guinea knows that Save the Children is now the interlocutor for funding for the Climate Office. I mean, I'm blown away by it.
Thanks. I'll take that. I think we've heard both these points of view. So if there's anyone else in the room that has a question for the panel, that would be great.
Otherwise, Tamara, I can ask a bit of a follow-up question, if it's okay. And maybe, Mariana, if you want to go first. Mariana has a flight to go back to Melbourne and look after her kids at 4 o'clock. So maybe you can go first and then you can leave the room and go to the airport. I don't want you to get stressed, and get stuck in traffic. So I know, exactly. But if you want to have my 21 and 17-year-old kids at your place for 2 days, you're more than welcome to try a completely different experience. Look, it's a little bit of a follow-up question to the conversation we're having. And it's a bit of a reflection of, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, there has been a lot of push on local empowerment, decentralization, try to make sure the local organization take the lead. So what's happening with the funding cuts? Unfortunately, big organizations like Save the Children, they have to cut jobs, but they will survive because, of course, they are large organizations. So small organizations, small local organizations, maybe organizations that were just, working on 1 or 2 USAID projects, they will disappear. So I'm kind of wondering, the question is, are we actually going backwards? Because after working so much towards local empowerment, now the risk is that only the large organization will survive and the small one will not. And if you agree with the assumption, what can we do to at least minimize the damage?
So I think part of the answer to this is how we define humanitarianism. And to answer, I think Kate was your name in the back. I'm not a development system or development finance expert, so I can't answer that question specifically about the development sector, but I can tell you in the humanitarian system, finally people are having the conversation and realizing that we've been talking about a value or a principle of independence for decades, and people have questioned it and been called heretics. And no one wanted to admit that, in fact, our organizations weren't really that independent. If one person can sign an executive order and 50% of the funding in that system is gone overnight, and it creates the level of chaos and disruption. So silver lining for me is, yes, my view is the system has always done what any system is designed to do, which is self-perpetuate itself. in all of these different ways. We all have our different incentives, whether it's my job or my prestige or my organization or my mandate or blah, blah, blah. The system and actors within that system will always devolve to the thing that makes the system perpetuate itself, whether it has US aid funding or not. It will just adjust, and the humanitarian reset will shake some things out. But I would like to change the focus because, again, most of the way the world survives in times of crisis has very little to do with that humanitarian funding and that system. Yes, it's life-saving. Yes, it's critical. I'm not saying we don't need humanitarian funding. It's unforgivable what's happened in the last 6 months. We will never be able to count the number of people's lives that were impacted. We had some restructure. It was very painful and very difficult to lose staff. But I'm not worried about staff in Australia. I'm very worried about the staff who lost their jobs in Ethiopia and Nairobi and Sudan, and the people who didn't know how they were going to feed or educate or keep their kids safe from one day to the next. That's the real impact. The silver lining for me is, and I don't know how other people are trying to solve it, we as CHL are going to double down on our commitment to support those leaders. We're going to continue the dialogue with those communities. We're going to ask them, what do you need for leadership support? And I was myself literally on an hourly basis, as we had to make decisions really fast. We lost 40% of our funding for this one program, was our flagship program. I was asking myself every day, do we still have a right to exist? If we are entering a world where there's so little humanitarian funding that people can't feed or clothe or educate their children, should we even spend $50,000 on a leadership program? So I began talking to the graduates of our program, our alumni in 90 countries, and I can tell you demand for these programs has never been higher. Those leaders are saying, you know what, if the whole international system is pulling back and going backwards and less localization and less funding for local organizations and less, grand bargain, like how much time and money has been spent talking about the grand bargain commitment that my view is no one ever intended to fulfill. I think it was a distraction from the real power dynamics, and we made it all about this dollar amount. Let communities speak for themselves. Let's support them, and that's our little niche in this world. And I don't know, until I have leaders telling me, actually, we'd rather have the $50,000 for this food program. As long as they're saying, can I get on the wait list? I need to be able to find resilience. I need to find resilience for my team. I need to get creative. I need to get innovative. We'll provide the space for it.
Thank you. So beautifully said. Now, safe flight back to Melbourne. Please, are you sure? You're a humanitarian. You love the drama of almost missing a flight, right? Okay, that's your job. Supipi, please.
I think we need to be true to ourselves to admit that, yes, we love to change the leadership, locally led, all that, but eventually finance play a significant role in the architecture we are all actors of. And it drives power, whether we like it or not. And that power sits primarily in the global north today. So I think we collectively have a responsibility. G20 have started this conversation for the last decade or so to, number one, influence those actors who are able to be partners of this system to come to the forefront of it. In my previous role with IFRC, that's what I have been doing, trying to get the Asia-Pacific leaders to come to the forefront of this dialogue, because how much we like it or we don't like it, the dialogue is entirely, like when you bring the 50 governments who funds the Red Crosses in Asia-Pacific region, it's completely dominated by the global north. The actors who are powerful here, including Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, China, India, all of them, they say quiet. And at some point I was asking the question, is language the problem? Because, as somebody who's not having English as my native language, I have to translate it. And by the time I translate in my head, the West has taken the discourse to another step or two, right? I mean, so what are those small pieces that you need to invest in as we think of investment in leadership? It may sound ridiculous, but at times it is the real challenge. So, I mean, some of these things are fundamentals in the architecture, but we need to look at it. I mean, including Australia since 2014, like, can they step up in this moment? What are we doing to influence collectively that stepping up? I mean, I know there's lots happening, but how much can they take over? How much can they influence? I was using Australian government counterparts to ask, can you be a co-leader for me to go and talk to government of South Korea and to the government of Indonesia? Because if you look at a country like Indonesia, the government can invest a significant proportionate to that investment landscape. So how do we think about this and work collectively in partnership to consciously, intentionally redefine the architecture we are part of? I mean, I think as part of that, the work, the partnership you have initiated is incredibly important.
Thanks, Matt.
Before I worked in aid and development, I worked in politics, and this might be a little bit controversial, right? But I'm a pragmatist, and I think my view is that the political economy of aid and development is very, very fragile indeed. Because when you think about aid, it is wealth transfer from developed economies to developing countries. And the wealth is taxpayer money pledged by governments who were elected to benefit those taxpayers. And if the government or the will of the taxpayers, the voters, falls away for aid and development, then the political economy of aid falls over. And just look what's happened in the US, right? The Trump thought no consequence. Trump thought he had a mandate to slash aid because the general public didn't care enough to support it. And here we are. So I'm with everyone on the philosophy, but the pragmatist in me says there is, and this is why I say ethical intermediary, right? Because I think a government like Australia will always say there are certain preconditions on the money we give that we expect in return. We're not going to hand over a blank check because it's ultimately we're acting on behalf of voters in the Australian economy, the Australian public. So I think we've got to just take the moments we can, gain ground, improve the transparency, the transfer of power, the investment in local leadership, but also be cognizant that it's very, very fragile, this balance. And if it goes too far, and in the eyes of the Australian public, in our case, if it's seen that Australia doesn't get anything in return or doesn't have any Australian conditions or values attached to its aid program, then I really worry that the program itself falls over. And then we're having a debate about nothing.
I mean, to be very honest, as a European, as much as we love saying bad things about Trump, I mean, you see most of the European governments are doing exactly the same, regardless to their political nature. You know, in the UK, Labour government basically decided to move the aid to development budget into defense. The Netherlands, when I grew up in Europe, the Netherlands for me were the kind of paradise of budgetary allocation for international development, and now they're doing exactly the same. So, and I think the narrative is exactly what we have been voted by people to pursue a political agenda, and this political agenda says that international development is no longer a priority, so we are basically walking the talk. You really don't want to go to the airport, Mariana, right? You're ready to say one more thing? 2 minutes, and then we're going to wrap up.
Just might also agree with Matt. I don't have a political background, but I do think we have to be somewhat pragmatic. And this is, for me, why I'm not actually having the conversations anymore and putting all of my energy into systems change. I'm like, oh, systems doing what it's going to do. And Matt's right. What we just saw happen, Trump took a risk that the American public, and I can tell you as an American, the identity of Americanism is partly built on the fact that we're supposed to be a force of good in the world. And he called the bluff. There was a little bit of public backlash, but like in very small corners of the liberal universe in the US. And I have family from both sides of the spectrum, and so I sit kind of uniquely in the middle. And I can tell you there was not enough outcry. This is not a temporary shift. It's not going to change with the next administration. It's been a trend since actually Obama. And the global trend, if you look at the graphs, more people in need, less funding in the system, and it is one election or one decision. And now that the US is showing itself to be an unreliable defense partner for many places, what just happened? Defense budgets went up, aid budgets will go down, taxpayer money, taxes are not going to go up to provide more aid when people in domestic contexts are feeling cost of living. So I agree with this point completely, that there is a point where we have to be practical and we have to save lives, we have to look out for child rights. The system, though, that sits behind that is just fundamentally broken, in my opinion.
We have time for another question. Or do you want to wrap up?
I was about to wrap up, but you are the chair, so you decide, Tamara. You are the boss here.
From me, Federica. It's a question broadly for the panel. So we're clearly in a transition point, whether it's aid, whether it's the global political system. And that transition point is, it seems to me, perpetuating greater conflict or potential for conflict, which requires greater humanitarian needs and action, which is then, you know, challenged by the lack of funding, by the lack of intensity towards that. But then that's also, that system is perpetuating because in political systems, whether it's the US, but also in Australia, when irregular migration happened and you devoted $1 billion almost towards irregular migration instead of aid, no one batted an eyelid, right? So if that perpetuates, how do we service those in need, I guess?
We need another conference.
My little niche is preparing for that reality by supporting as many leaders at the local level. I want them to stop looking to Geneva and New York for answers, and I want them to be able to innovate at the local level with what is true in their local area. If you look, for example, just at the Sudan emergency response rooms and what these young people have done to set up community kitchens, it is incredible. And I don't know, look at the world as it is now and then multiply it by 100-fold with climate crisis and all of those corners. I think, yeah, that's not a very positive note.
Well, I've got a positive. So I think we've got to look beyond grant funding and taxpayer money, right? It's got to be about capital investment for impact. So the thing that we are trying to do in Save the Children, we are relying on grant-based funding for the vast majority of our work, institutional donors, governments and UN agencies, supplemented by the general public to offset the costs which they don't cover. That's our basic business model, right? The real opportunity is to say, how do we leverage private sector finance, capital that can invest in impact and financial return? So we've got some impact investment funds where we've started. They're investing in health and education and technology startups that have a dual impact for children, or a clean cook stove company, for example, and we're trying to generate financial return. So it's trying to leverage, well, let's face it, grant money is tiny compared to capital flows into developing countries. So if we can try and leverage some of that capital for development outcomes as well as just financial return, then that to me is the future and something we can be a little bit optimistic about.
I think we've got a
Sorry, I'll just, can you hear me? Yeah, I'll just add something to it. So, I mean, we all try to do, how do we leverage the existing money to generate more money from a business point of view or not-for-profit point of view on a day-to-day basis. But I think gloom and doom world order, I personally think there'll be a lot more individuals who are going to be looking at us for that inspiration or change, whether we like it or not, because the trust on state apparatuses are increasingly going down. But in that, I also think it's an opportunity to really redefine what humanitarianism and development is. As a young graduate in the university, I used to say in Sri Lanka, I don't want to define development in Sri Lanka by the Western norms. Just because a Sri Lankan doesn't wear the shoes and walk on the street, it does not make you underdeveloped, because the soil is so pure, you actually can. Just because you don't have a fridge does not mean you're underdeveloped, because there were traditional ways of preserving our food. So do we go back to our roots and redefine what development is? In this case, I might even align with the countries like North Korea when they come and say, don't come and tell us what emergency response in the Western world looks like here to save lives. So probably, so we may have to redefine what does that look like from, not from Geneva and New York point of view, but from what does Pacific Islanders define development as, and go from bottom up again, rather than looking at from top down. But in that world order, I strongly believe we have a significant role to play to give some inspiration to the world and hope of change.
Thank you.
Well, we're here to participate. We are here to participate. Yeah. So if Pacific people can't give their points of view, then why am I here?
Yeah, I want to hear your points of view. Closing up.
All right, look, if I may ask Mad Mariana and Supipi to thank you guys, because this is exactly what we were hoping to have, a very engaged audience. I know that some of the conversation have been difficult, but this is actually, in my opinion, much better than having a much more traditional session where we just, tell you what we do and then a couple of questions. So thank you very much for being with us, and thank you very much for engaging with us. We really appreciate it. And on the other side, if I can ask you to join me in thanking our panelists with a very short clap, because Mariana has to go to the airport. Thanks a lot and enjoy the coffee break. Thank you.